Yeah, hi Ian and hi panel. So my question for the panel is are the growing campus protests, and the growing anti-war protests across America and across the world really, are they on the right side of history? And the second part is, will history judge the support the war has received from Western leaders very harshly? So there's two parts. Like I'm comparing it a bit with the Vietnam. How they were on the right side of history and the leaders were judged harshly. Is there a parallel here? Are the protesters on the right side of history?
Claire Fox.
I don't think they're anti-war protests. I think they're anti-Israel protests. That's the first thing to suggest. I can't stand the phrase "the right side of history" because it effectively closes down debate. It's one of those things about, are you a backward Neanderthal dinosaur type or are you on the right side of history? So I think it's kind of historically illiterate.
Oh, you looked at David when you said that.
I feel very strongly that something very unpleasant is happening on these university campuses, but I absolutely defend their right to have the protests, to have the sit-ins, to do whatever they want. That's an entirely legitimate free speech right to protest. I would, go along with that. The kind of things, just because we've only, to be brief, where people are kind of dressed up in almost militarised gear, sitting outside the library, saying, "Are you a Zionist?" and what, not letting you in if you try and get in. The driving people out who are they say are Zio genocide supporters, and I mean some of the language is pretty offensive to say the least. These are their fellow Jewish students, by the way, and the way that. I think that the absolute demonisation of anyone who's pro-Israel, the inability to understand what October the 7th meant, and I have had decades, because I'm old, I've had decades of having been somebody who supported Palestinian self-determination, was horrified at the Islamicisation of the movement in the Middle East, the fact that Hamas took over in Gaza and actually butchered, and I mean butchered, people who supported Palestinian liberation, treated women and people from marginalised communities like animals and dirt and locked them up and so on and so forth. To then have a situation where, when you're saying, it's just like the Vietnam War. I just watched some speeches today from some of the universities in America that were heralding Hamas as freedom fighters. I mean, this is not hyperbole, saying that the Houthis were the greatest rebels and that we could now look to Yemen as friends of liberation. I mean, come on. And so what I think is that we've got ourselves into a really confused, morally and politically confused place. What I'd really like to see, because there's obviously two sides in this argument, I completely appreciate that, is there are people who think that Israel's gone too far. There's people who think that their war, the way that they're fighting this war is without mercy. There are people who are more forgiving of that because of what happened and they feel it's an existential fight for their lives and so on. All of that's true, but we're certainly not debating this in any kind of a serious way, which is what you would want on a university campus.
Okay. Ava. That was a big sigh.
Yeah, because you know what? I don't even want to talk about this, to be completely honest. I don't. I feel that it's such a toxic debate. I believe, just to answer the question, I believe that the people on the university campuses are entitled to protest if they want. I think having snipers in university and stuff, I think all that's going too far. The way that Claire has characterised those reference speeches, I haven't seen what she's talking about. That's not what I've seen. But I also feel like when it comes to the conversation about Israel, I believe there's just not that much freedom to be able to talk. I've been to Israel. I used to date an Israeli, but I went to Israel, and when you're in Israel, they speak so much more freely than we do. They can say, you know what I mean? The stuff that they say in Israel about the whole situation, those conversations could never happen here. And what I'm wary of is that when you do try to say something, sometimes your words are twisted, and I don't want my words to be twisted. I do object to the term Islamification. As a Muslim, I object to that term because I think that carries connotations to it that are just not right. I don't like that at all. I would say that in terms of I would say in terms of the Israel issue, I don't think it's a Muslim Jewish issue. I think it is an issue about land. It is an issue about, who owns the land, who's got the right to the land. That's what the issue is. It's not anything. And I think when we keep putting Jewish people, Muslim, there's so many who've got such different points of view. I think it all gets mixed up. It's not a religious fight. It's a fight over land.
Sam?
Look, I mean, this is one of the biggest issues in my constituency. I probably have more correspondence on what's happening in the Middle East.
Did you have a large Muslim vote?
Yeah, but to be honest, like local churches are raising money for Gaza. It's not, I went to see my local Gurdwara not too long ago, and actually they brought up what's going on in Gaza with me, and I was a little bit surprised about that, actually. So it's definitely not like a communal issue for one community whatsoever. I think a lot of people will feel that the reason these campus protests and protests in this country, because we're on 6 months now of pretty much almost weekend protests in London have happened, is because in the past, Israel has been able to posit itself as the only democracy in the Middle East. It's the most ethical army in the world, all these different things, and a lot of people bought into some of that. But now people have smartphones in which the reality of how barbaric their war has been on civilians, and with 35,000 dead, has been beamed into the palms of millions of people around the world. And actually, I think that in time to come, 10, 15 years, Israel will regret actually how it's carried out this war. I do actually believe that. I think already many Israelis think that as well. Netanyahu will get kicked out at the next election, there's no doubt about that. And the most vociferous advocates, by the way, for the ending of this barbaric war are actually the parents of the hostages. And I think if you listen to them, it's very, very telling that actually what's gone on is, of course, Israel's right to defend itself against the awful and disgraceful attacks that Hamas just launched out of the blue. But to then, if you listen to the language of Israeli ministers themselves, this very much quickly became actually about implementing a plan they wanted, which is to essentially expel the Palestinian people from Gaza. But it's their own words, Claire. It's their own words. If you listen to people like Ben Gvir, these are extremists that no one in this country should be supporting. And even David Cameron, alongside people like me, called for sanctions against some of these Israeli ministers because they were so extreme. And when you've got extremists like that on both sides in charge, you are going to find it very difficult to find peace. And I think, I certainly don't support any of the language that Claire mentioned in terms of those student protests. But the thing that's different about these protests compared to the Vietnam protests, the Vietnam protests, for a long period of time, did not have actually the support of the majority of people in the US. All of the opinion polling now in the US says that these students, in terms of broadly what they're standing for, the sort of end of that war, the end of support to Israel, has huge support in in the US. And that is both a problem for Biden and actually meaning that they're expressing something which is actually more widely held in the student movement in the US. And that's a big difference to Vietnam in the 1960s.